Hi, welcome to Easy Exposure, the tutorials about photography. In this lesson we will be talking about different type of files. Of course, all of you probably know JPEGs, because those are industry standards. But every camera also have their native files, which are called RAW. So what actually are the RAW files? And what's the difference between RAW and JPEGs? About that we'll be talking in this lesson. Let's get started. As you can see from diagram, the RAW files are clean, unprocessed files which coming right away of camera sensor, unlike JPEG files, to which certain adjustments like Bayer interpolation, contrast sharpness, white balance, tone, hue, saturation were already applied in the camera. JPEGs were also compressed in the camera. Since RAW files are unprocessed files, you will need a special processing software which you can use to process the RAW files. And my favorite, the one I use all the time, is Adobe Lightroom. Also use the Adobe Camera Raw, which actually comes with Photoshop. A good software, another software is also Capture One. I also heard a lot of good things about Picasa, which you can actually download for free. I never tried it, but I read a lot of reviews and a lot of people talking good about this, so I'm about to try it soon. Also, camera manufacturers, they have their own RAW processing softwares, like for example for Nikon there is Nikon Capture NX, or for Canon it's Canon's Digital Photo Professional. Also, different camera manufacturers have their own native RAW files with different file extensions. So here's the list of some of them. JPEGs and RAW files have their own pros and cons. So let's talk about JPEG first. First of all, the JPEG is much smaller in size. And it doesn't really need a post-processing if you don't want to, because the JPEG was processed in the camera already. Also, the files, JPEG files, are ready to print or email right away without any processing. And you can easily view them and edit with any image editing program. Also, JPEGs allows you to fire your camera more rapidly, like for example if you shoot some action and you having your camera in the burst mode where you take frame by frame really fast. So due to its smaller size, JPEG will process faster in the camera. The cons of the JPEGs are that JPEG is compressed file, which means it loses some image data. It's also much more difficult to correct mistakes of color and exposure with JPEGs, which is much easier with RAW. Because JPEGs have less information of them because they were compressed. And that's why you will have less control over the way your final image appears, because your camera is processing the image. Of course you can adjust JPEGs too, but not to that extent as you can adjust RAWs. The main advantage of RAW is that because RAW is uncompressed file, no data is lost. And that's why RAW will allow you to correct mistakes made at the time of exposure. Like for example, if your exposure is not right, RAW file will allow you to correct that exposure plus minus almost 2 stops. Which with JPEG you will have some problems with that. And you will have a lot of flexibility with manipulating your images in post-production with RAW. Also, adjustments made in post-processing are non-destructive. What does that mean? That if you make any adjustments to your RAW file, you will always be able to get back to your original. Even if you don't like how you processed and you made some mistakes, you can always go back to your original file. Your original file is untouched. The cons of the RAW file is that the files are much larger compared to JPEGs. And image can't be used immediately for printing or emailing or whatever you want to use it. It needs to be processed first and converted into JPEG. And you will need a special program to edit raw images. Also, it of course requires time and effort to develop RAW files. Because if you have a RAW and JPEG file of the camera and you compare them, you might notice that some JPEGs will look better than unprocessed RAW because some adjustments like contrast, saturation was already applied to JPEG image, but as a final result you can do the adjustments to the RAW and get actually better image that you would get with a JPEG processed in the camera. So based on those pros and cons, when would you shoot JPEG and when would you shoot RAW? So I would suggest that you should shoot JPEG if you have a limited storage, like you have a small memory card or limited space on the hard drive. But I think nowadays it's not as big of the problem as what it was just a few years ago, because memory cards and hard drives become much cheaper right now. So it wouldn't be as big of the problem anymore. Also, if you don't like and you wouldn't want to do any post-production or just a minimal post-production, then you should shoot JPEGs. But post-production is a very interesting part of photography, and I would suggest just give it a try. You can do so much more with post-production than you can do in the camera. Also, I would shoot JPEGs if you need your images right away. For example, you're shooting event and you're required to give your images right away after event. But in this case, I would maybe shoot both. Some cameras allow you to shoot JPEGs and RAWs at the same time. Also, when you shoot fast action like sport, for example, and you have your camera in a burst mode where you take frame by frame really fast, the JPEG would process faster. But modern cameras, more expensive high-end cameras, can handle RAWs pretty well in the burst mode. Also, there are faster memory cards which handle RAW better. So when should you shoot RAW? To be honest, I shoot RAW most of the time. And when I need JPEGs immediately, I usually shoot RAW and JPEGs at the same time. So if you enjoy post-processing and want more flexibilities on your pictures, you should shoot RAW, because RAW gives you so much more than JPEG can in terms of post-processing. Also, if you shoot something under difficult lighting conditions, for example, when you think that your highlights might be overexposed, to bring those highlights back, to recover them is so much easier with a RAW file. Also, when you're unsure about your white balance or you're unsure about your exposure, to correct those is much easier with RAW file, because it contains so much more information than JPEG. Because when the JPEG was compressed, a lot of information was lost. Let me show you what I mean. Here is the picture of myself, which is about 2 stops overexposed, and I shot JPEG and RAW simultaneously. I will try to correct this picture in Lightroom. I'm not gonna make any extensive adjustments, but I will just slide the exposure sliders -2 stops. So I corrected the exposure -2 and made both images 2 stops darker. As you can see, the difference between RAW and JPEG file is very noticeable. The RAW file looks much better. JPEG files lost some highlights. The highlights are blown out. So, And this was correction of 2 stops, and without any extensive corrections, just with the exposure slider. I just want to show you something real quick. Do you remember this image I used for my light metering lesson? And I told you that this scene is kind of hard to meter and expose because you have very bright sky and you have a dark subject. So the sky and the landscape require different exposures. But if you have a RAW file, you can actually recover some of those highlights in your sky and you can make your landscape brighter. So we go to Develop Module in Lightroom and let's recover some of those highlights. When you press here on histogram, you can see where your highlights are. So we slide the recovery slider and we actually recover some of those highlights. You can see just a little bit of them left, which is not that big of a deal. So when you shoot in this situation, it's always better to be a little bit underexposed than overexposed, because if your sky is totally blown out, there is no information there and there is nothing to recover. But now let's try to make our landscape brighter. We can use a fill light in this case. And see, it's getting brighter. Just a small adjustments, but what a difference. Let's take a look before, without this, and after. Let me show you real quick how to change your file type in the camera, and I use Nikon D7000. If we go to the camera menu, and then we will go to the shooting menu, which is assigned with a little camera. And then we will go to Image Quality. And then click on Image Quality and gives you options. My camera can shoot RAW and RAW plus JPEG, and then JPEG fine, normal, and basic. So I can have all those choices. Some cameras don't let you to shoot both RAW and JPEGs. It all depends on the camera. And this is another way. So when I press this button right here, and then I go to the top, I can see my file type right here. And then when I scroll it, the file type will change. Hope this lesson was helpful for you, and now you know the difference between JPEGs and RAW files. And those of you who never tried to shoot in RAW, give it a try.